Okay, everybody, we're going to get started here. Welcome. This is the launch of the 2026 Socialist Register. We have with us some distinguished panelists. We have Paul Heideman, Ibrahim Shikaki, and Arun Kundnani of MR Press. Paul and Ibrahim are contributors to the volume, and Arun is the new editor of Monthly Review Press. So we're going to get started with Arun just going to say a couple words about MR Press, who is the publisher of the Register in the US. And then I'm going to introduce the volume. I'm the co-editor of the Socialist Register, Steve Maher. And then we're going to have some presentations from our two contributors, and then we're going to move into a discussion. So Arun, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Because we're starting a little late, sorry about that. I will not talk for too long because we want to get to hear from the contributors and have enough time for a bit of a discussion at the end. Monthly Review Press is the oldest socialist press in the United States. We've been around since the 1940s. We're very honored to be publishing Socialist Register. I was at a conference recently, like a kind of left-wing conference recently, and there's a lot of kind of labor activists and academics, most of whom were on the older side. But there was one guy who looked like he was 18 or something like that, and I started chatting to him, and he was like, I've just recently become a socialist. And I'm like, oh, great, how's that going? He's like, you've got to read a lot of books, haven't you? And I was like, wow, okay, yeah, I guess that's true. That's something that we do. We read a lot of books. We're not, the right wing just does memes, right? We do books. And I was like, is that a problem? Like, is that off-putting to people? I think in the end we need books, right? Because we need that detailed analysis that gives us a big picture of what's happening in the world so that we can understand it. And you can't do that on social media and short bursts of information. You need that discipline of being able to actually take in a whole analysis, right? And that's what Socialist Register does, I think, brilliantly in this edition especially. And that's what we try and do at Monthly Review Press. So over to you guys.
Thanks, Arun. So yeah, thanks very much to MR Press and the People's Forum for hosting and sponsoring this event. I'm really glad to be here. This is the first, I think it may be the first ever US launch of the Register. If it's not the first, it's certainly been quite a while since we've done one. The Register goes back to 1964. It was founded by Ralph Miliband and John Saville. Then it was taken over by my mentor, Leo Panich, until his passing a couple years ago, and now it's co-edited by Greg Albo and myself. So it has a long lineage of a particular strand of left politics that we think is really vital for the current moment, which is to say we need an independent left position in between the kind of Leninist vanguardist politics on the one hand and the social democratic politics that we associate with the European kind of post-war capitalist welfare state on the other hand. I'm particularly proud of this volume, the 2026 volume that we're launching here today, which I think is grappling with some of the most important dynamics and questions and unsettled questions that we face in the current moment as socialists and in terms of the working class. The crises in capitalism, as we know, crises are not the exception in capitalism, but the rule, and crises always impose the need for restructuring, right? We saw that in the late 19th century. We saw that in the 1930s with the Depression. We saw that after the 1970s crisis with the rise of neoliberalism. And the 2008 crisis, which is the third great crisis of American capitalism, is no different. And yet, the form of the restructuring that is coming out of the 2008 crisis, the form of accumulation that has emerged from that deepest crisis since the 1930s is profoundly unclear. We do see certain clear trends. Growing authoritarianism and the crisis of the state, the collapse of centrist neoliberal consensus across the advanced capitalist countries and beyond. Two Trump presidencies threatening or challenging, shifting profoundly at the very least, the central global role of the United States in accumulation. The fact that the American state remains the center of global capitalism means that crises of the American state immediately and automatically take on global proportions. They become a crisis of empire. And certainly the major shift in the US state orientation toward its global role that we've seen across two Trump presidencies now is quite clear. it appears to be forsaking its role at this, as the kind of critical force overseeing global integration that it has maintained since World War II. We see a shift from a pursuit of neoliberal global integration to a politics of America first that resembles a kind of narrow nationalist neo-mercantilism, quite a shift from the global integration project that the American state has steadfastly pursued since the Second World War. And this has been marked by tariffs, trade wars, and attacks on even its closest allies. And in particular, we see a shift from the rhetoric of the rules-based international order that has been so critical for securing and underpinning American hegemony since World War II, toward the naked embrace of violence and coercion, lawless violence and coercion, nowhere as pronounced as in the case of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza that we've been all witnessing over the past period. And Paul Heideman and Ibrahim Shikaki here next to me are going to spend some time talking about those things. We also see the rise of the far right around the world, from Italy to Austria to Turkey, India, and Argentina. And the places where the far right hasn't come to power, we see far right mobilizations as those forces build steam in the UK, Germany, and of course elsewhere. We see the rise of the tech sector and AI and the question of techno-feudalism. And of course all this against the backdrop of the mounting ecological crisis as the world hurtles toward the symbolic threshold of 2 degrees Celsius, breaching as it does a series of tipping points, which will bring irreversible and dangerous and unpredictable damage to millions, eventually billions of people around the world, to say nothing of the ecosystems that support all life on the planet. And of course, the ongoing process of the immiseration of the working class, exploding inequality, rising insecurity, and the mounting what is now being called affordability crisis. All this, and yet the left is still at an impasse. Despite the worrying acceleration of crises of the kinds that I've just mentioned, the strategic opening for left politics remains elusive, despite isolated hopeful signs. As of now, left forces internationally remain disorganized and relatively marginal. In this context, Ernest Mandel's notion of late capitalism has taken on a renewed relevance, and we see it everywhere. From Alberto Toscano's book, Late Fascism, which has struck a nerve with many on the left, to Cedric Durand, Jody Dean, and Yanis Varoufakis, invoking Mandel in different ways and theorizing what they call techno-feudalism. And most recently, Andreas Malm and Wim Carton's work about politics when it's too late, dealing with the climate catastrophe that's unfolding all around us. The notion of late capitalism in the book, I want to emphasize, has a question mark after late capitalism because it's raising the question of the utility of this framing for understanding and clarifying our current moment. The notion of late capitalism evokes a system that has survived beyond its functional lifespan, but that struggles on in a kind of afterlife. Yet is capitalism in decline? Despite the political, social, and ecological crises that we are now bearing witness to, does that mean that capitalism itself is nearing its end? That capitalism itself is weakening? Or do these crises precisely signal the strength of capitalism? Are they rather symptoms of the unchallenged dominance of a system that draws its strength from social and ecological ruination? And that the stronger the system becomes, the more severe can those crises be expected to be? In other words, is the problem that we face the weakness of capital or the unchallenged dominance of capital? The question that comes to mind, I think, as runs through the essays in the volume in this context is what forms is accumulation now taking amidst these ruins? How is capitalism evolving amidst the ruins that it has created? How are we to understand the restructuring and reconfiguration of accumulation in the current moment amidst so much hardship and suffering and ecological crisis? Indeed, the idea that capitalism has been nearing its demise has hung heavy over Marxian analysis long before Mandel. In 1858, when he was preparing an early draft of the Grundrisse, as the 1858 crisis was unfolding around him, Karl Marx himself wondered whether capitalism would ever be able to recover from the current crisis that he was witnessing at that time. And yet it did. Capitalism rebounded and was indeed strengthened in the process of the recovery from that relatively short but sharp downturn, leading Marx to abandon the idea in his own work that capitalism and collapse, that capitalist crisis would lead to the collapse of the system automatically. The danger, I think, is that the notion of lateness can lead to fatalism, that time is running out and that we can't act. It can lead to a surrender to capitalist inevitability or to the inevitability of the collapse of the system. The challenge in this conjuncture, I would argue, is to find ways to reclaim time against capitalist inevitability and the passive expectation of collapse. And all of the essays in the volume take up this challenge, and they seek to do so without falling prey to a nostalgic fantasy that we can return to post-war social democracy or an ideal liberal internationalism that was always unstable, always predicated on imperial violence, always predicated on the exploitation of workers, and always predicated on profound inequalities and class struggle. Despite their differences, the essays are united around at least one point. It is later than we think, and therefore all the more urgent that we find ways to begin to move beyond the rule of capital. I'm going to quickly read a quote from the preface of the volume. Getting somewhere better ultimately means taking capital away from capital and moving towards socialism. This project, in turn, begins from a sober analysis of the present. Capitalism, it is worth emphasizing, has proven remarkably capable of outrunning every obituary Marxists have written for it. Already in 1915, the Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hilferding recognized the connection between the notion that capitalism was destined to collapse on its own and political passivity. Quote, "Capitalism's economic suicide, its own self-annihilation," he wrote, "for which the proletariat must wait in order to introduce socialism, cannot occur. Such a theory of economic collapse," he continued, "is not only fundamentally false, but inevitably leads to political quietism. On the contrary," he continued, "the question of socialism is not a question of capitalism's abstract potential expansion, but rather a question of the proletariat's political power." Many years later, Leo Panitch reached a similar conclusion, arguing that, quote, "it is through crises that capitalism historically has tended to recover its dynamism. Where and when it is unable to do so, and where no viable socialist alternative, or at least few means of democratic defense exist, the consequences are always appalling." In some sense, then, the only true crises of capitalism occur when workers pose a serious threat to the system. Otherwise, one way or another, it trudges on. If economic breakdown leaves it unable to recover its technological and organizational vitality, the price paid by workers will only be that much higher. Moving beyond capitalism then requires politics, and especially the democratic development, the development of democratic capacities of the working class. So I'm going to just run through very quickly the table of contents for the volume and highlight some of the debates that the volume takes up. The first set of essays perhaps takes on the question of capitalism's decline or strength. Scott Aquano and I have an essay arguing that the crisis is capital's strength, not its decline. Cedric Durand, one of the leading theorists of techno-feudalism, has an essay pushing in the opposite direction, defending the techno-feudal hypothesis. Michael Roberts has an essay rooted in classical Marxian crisis theory. The second debate the volume takes up is on the nature of the US empire, the power of the dollar, and rising global tensions. Costas Lapavitsas, who's here with us today, as well as his co-author Raven Hart, look at Trump's chaotic imperialism. And Paul Heideman, sitting to my right, looks at Trump and capitalist class power and the impasse in his ability to restructure the world system. We also have Paramjit Singh on the limits of dollar dominance. The third set of essays looks at authoritarianism, fascism, and capitalist state forms. We have an essay by Alfredo Saad-Filo that looks at neoliberal fascism. An essay by Clyde Barrow that looks at the case of Christo-fascism, as he calls it in Texas, as a harbinger for how the Republican Party is evolving in a fascist direction. We have Adam Hania pushing against the myth of Arab exceptionalism in terms of authoritarian regimes. We have Ibrahim Shikaki, sitting to my right here, who looks at Palestine and the roots of the Gaza genocide. And Dayub Chang looks at a different path to authoritarianism in Korea, coming out of the developmental state. Finally, we have essays that take up the question of socialist strategy and progressive alternatives. Munoz, Martinez, and Alvarez Bahar look at the dilemmas of progressive government in Mexico. Hilary Wainwright and Michael Calderbank interview Mark Serwadka and Beth Winter on your party in the UK. So those are our essays, and I think it's a really strong collection that grapples some of the most important questions we're facing. Now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, who are going to give some brief presentations, followed by a discussion, and then we'll take a little Q&A. So I don't know who wants to go first. Go ahead, Ibrahim.
All right. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Ibrahim Shikaki. Right now, I teach at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm there in the economics department. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my essay in the Socialist Register. I think it goes without saying that what the Palestinian people are currently facing is one of the most difficult and challenging junctures in their political history. I grew up during the first Intifada as a young kid in the town of Tulkarem. During the second Intifada, I was at Birzeit University, back when there was an Israeli tank in every single city in the West Bank, and we had 2 months of curfew. And my father's family went through a Nakba in 1948. They're now refugees in the Gaza Strip, and my grandfather would tell us stories about what happened then. And yet never in the history of the Palestinian people do you see the magnitude, right, of death, of destruction, as you see today. And yet, though, right, still, this is not an anomaly. This is not an aberration. This is part of a 150-year project of settler colonialism. And so what I do in my essay is focus less on what has been going on for the last 2.5 years, but asking the question, how did we get to where we are today? So what do I use to do that? I use political economy. That is the method that I use. A lot of people use political economy to mean different things. But the way that I see it, political economy is about understanding and analyzing power. And power can still be a kind of vague term. And so the way that I present, at least implicitly in my article, power, is by looking at how power manifests itself, A, materially, B, intellectually, and C, ideologically. And again, those are still vague, so I'm going to spend the 8 minutes that I have to talk about those 3 manifestations of power. So part of the essay, if you're interested in reading it, right, is that economic history. There's a lot of political history, wonderful work. Avi Schleim, Rashid Khalidi, Ilan Pape, absolutely. But there is something missing in terms of the political economy history. And so those 3 sets, those 3 manifestations of power that I use, the first is material, right? So that means how is power manifesting itself in the structure of economic analysis? Now, again, you don't need to be an economist, but I think you have an idea, at least in traditional economics, there's this notion of neutrality a little bit. So wages of workers represent productivity, right? Prices reflect scarcity. Markets are neutral. You have rational agents. That's literally the word that they use. Agents, right, who are making decisions. And yet what that does is brush aside anything that has to do with the production side, with distribution, with inequality. That is set aside. Okay, so how does this have to do with Palestine? Well, you can think not only of what's been going on the last 20, 30 years, not only since 1967, the occupation, actually even before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. One example that I use is the Zionist organizations that used to work in Palestine prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. So those organizations, I want to hear some of their names, the Jewish Colonization Association. You can't make that up. That is the name of the organization. The very first bank that today is called Bank Leumi was called the Jewish Colonial Trust, right? So what they did, they completely distorted anything that has to do with this idea of free market and neutrality. Labor, land, and capital were all distorted. So it's important. So you asked me, Ibrahim, why is it important to think about that? Why is it important to go back 150 years ago? Because the everlasting problem that we have is that we still, unfortunately, confuse the symptom and the disease. And so all the time we're trying to attack the symptom, but we don't talk about the disease itself. So those are Zionist organizations. They would buy Palestinian land, and once they bought that land, it would become completely outside of circulation, because then it becomes, and this is their own words, the property of the Jewish people, which means Palestinians, even if they had access, they would not be able to buy it. Capital that would come from all around the world, it would not go where capital is supposedly profitable, it would go to Jewish-only industries. Labor. If you are part of the Histadrut, which is the Jewish union, you would be able to work. Otherwise, you do not have labor that is secured. So looking at power from that sense, right, materially, looking at how power in economic analysis, traditional economics takes away from that power. The second sense is thinking about power intellectually. And by that particularly, I'm differentiating here between so think about this more, I forgot your name, heckler guy. So think about that in the sense of power within the profession of economics itself. There is a hegemonic approach to economics, started in the late 1800s, and took away the political economy messiness. They said, we don't want the messiness of the political part. We are now economics. We are now the science of economics. That is the one that is built on market fundamentalism. So all the other ones, the ones that do talk about distribution, that talk about social relations of production, that talk about gender, those are fought against in terms of positions, in terms of journal articles that are published, and in terms of policy making. Now again, you don't need to be a nerd like me who's interested in history of economic thought or the philosophy of science to feel how important this is in the Palestinian context. Think about what the mainstream approach to economics in Palestine is. They will tell you a relationship between a strong economy and a poor economy will be beneficial for that poor economy. There will be positive spillovers between the strong and the weak economy, and what you will end up with is some version of a convergence between these. Now again, because this is an apolitical theory, it takes away everything that we know, not only has happened in Palestine, but what capitalism is about and what that relationship between capital and labor is about. What you actually see in the Palestinian context is what we call that dependency relationship. And to put it very simply, dependency shows itself through these opposite movements. Resources, so that's natural resources and human resources, labor, move from the poor economy to the weak economy, right? So in the Palestinian case, you get the Israelis stealing land, stealing water, stealing minerals, and Palestinian labor working in Israel. So that's one movement. The other movement is the movement of final goods. And the movement of goods is from the strong economy to the weak economy. So if you don't talk about dependency in that sense, you don't understand where value added is actually being created, then you believe that myth of convergence that you have. And that's why it's important to think about power intellectually in terms of what approach to economics that you take. And finally, the third manifestation of power within the Palestinian context is more ideological. So economics does not only believe that it does a good job in economic questions, it actually believes it does a good job with anything that has to do with human behavior. You will find courses in economics called the economics of education, the economics of family, the economics of crime. I mean, there's a story behind it, but again, like only for nerds like me, they would find it interesting. But the idea is economics calls itself the queen of social sciences, right? There's this authority that comes from the economic narrative. And what better way to put more authority through what? The Nobel Prize in Economics, which very few people realize it's not actually one of those Nobel Prizes. Like the original 5, 6 ones were in the early 1900s. The economics prize was invented in the 1960s by the Swedish Central Bank. I mean, I'm not making this up, right? There's a very nice book, The Noble Factor. Everybody knows this, you can Google it. But the idea is that it gives authority. So again, how is this relevant in terms of the Palestinian context? Well, you can think of every single, and I probably went through all of them, economic or development plan that has been set forward for Palestine. And all of them discuss this notion of the economic narrative. There's in the early 1990s, you had the World Bank with this huge 6-volume called Investment in Peace that is built on this idea of, you know what, let economics do its thing. Just put those business people together, then everything is going to work out. In 2011, the quartet, that's US, Russia, UN, and some other group, right? They had a plan. John Kerry had a plan in 2014. Kushner had a plan in 2019. All of these plans are based on this idea that the economic narrative will triumph. And the best example of that is the Gaza Trump plan, right? And again, very few people know that this was actually built on this horrible journal article by a professor in George Washington University. And that article talks about approaching Palestine devoid from its political context. We should look at Palestine, I mean, look it up. It's a don't look it up, but it's a horrible article. The idea is that what we're going to do is, and again, literally this is verbatim, what we are going to do is we are going to look at Palestine as if it is a bankruptcy situation. That's how it's done. We're going to have 50 years, we're going to have investors put money, and after 50 years, those investors, I know, right? Those investors are going to determine the sovereignty of Palestinians in Gaza. And so that is the third kind of the narrative, the economic narrative, the ideological aspect of power. And so what I try to do in the article is go through these. Again, it's not divided the way that I just explained it to you. It's more of an economic narrative. But the main point, and I'll finish with this, is that framing is not merely an academic exercise when it has to do with Palestine. Framing is extremely important because once we understand how Palestine is situated within the global economic system, within that relationship between labor capital, which is Palestinian labor, Israeli capital, then and only then can we think about the way forward, and can we think about short and long-term policies to address that real disease rather than the symptom. Thank you.
Thanks, Ibrahim. I wonder, should we go to Costas now, who's with us virtually, because I think he had a time crunch.
Thank you very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to address you. And obviously, I'm very pleased to have contributed to this issue of Socialist Register. I won't waste any more of my precious little time talking about the importance of the register and so on, because that has already been done. I will tell you what the work is about and give you some insight into what I and my research colleagues have been doing. We have basically been working on imperialism, understanding contemporary imperialism, with the United States at the epicenter. Because there is no doubt that imperialism has re-emerged as a characteristic phenomenon, perhaps the most characteristic phenomenon of contemporary capitalism, certainly since the great crisis of 2007-2009. And there is no doubt that the most aggressive imperial power is currently the United States. Now, I will make 4 points quickly. First is that imperialism today should be understood as a structure of coordination of global capitalist accumulation. That's the best way to understand it. And it is driven by a pairing of internationalized productive capital and globalized financial capital. That is the driving force behind imperialism. Neither of the two elements dominates the other, but they live off each other. Together, they form the most aggressive form of capital that we have known in the history of capitalism. The second point I will make is that the decisive hinge in the pairing of these two capitals is the dollar as world money. That is the characteristic feature of imperialism today. The dollar provides the mechanism that disciplines, enforces, and reproduces imperialism today. The third point I want to make is that militarism and military power is integral to this imperial structure. It's an integral component of it, as it has always been in the history of capitalism. And in this regard, we can think of contemporary imperialism as the combination of the dollar and the F-35. These are two sides of the same coin. The fourth point, and it's a methodological point really, is that I believe that this approach to it follows the classic Marxist analysis of imperialism, which seeks to explain it on the basis of economic conduct and economic behavior, but obviously at the same time pushes it to explain the contemporary phenomena rather than what we observed more than 100 years ago. Now, on this basis, what I'm arguing is that contemporary capitalism presents us with an incredible paradox, hegemonic paradox, whereby the leading productive power in the world is not the leading monetary and financial power. This paradox is fundamental to understanding how contemporary imperialism unfolds. And to be precise, and as we've done in a series of papers and more work that will come out, China controls 30% of the global manufacturing value added. China is a national entity, is a national social formation, but only 3% of the global reserves of internationally accepted money. The United States controls 16% of manufacturing value added, but more than 6% of the reserves. This is the defining feature of contemporary imperialism. Understanding it is of crucial importance. Because, of course, the dollar is a lot more than simply a reserve currency. That's the easiest way to see what it is, but the dollar does a lot more than that. In Marxist terminology, the dollar is world money, a characteristic aspect of money, a function of money that Marx learned from the mercantilists. It's a function that classical political economy never recognized. And within Marxist political economy, world money performs specific functions in the world market, characteristic functions which make it stand apart from domestic money. In contemporary heterodox theory, this appears as the hierarchies of currencies. Post-Keynesians have discovered or rediscovered some aspects of that. And in those hierarchies of currencies, the dollar sits right at the top with a series of other secondary currencies underneath it, and then the great bulk of the hoi polloi of currencies that have got national or domestic roles, but very little internationally. Now, the dollar in this regard is the main invoice of global trade, the main invoice unit of global trade, the collateral for global liquidity, the main instrument for swift settlement among banks, and so on. All this, and that's where the paradox comes into play, comes from the institutional, the political, and the military power of the United States, not its economic prevalence, its economic preeminence. But the paradox gets even more complex and important when you look more closely at it, more closely at the production side and the financial side. Because China does appear to be, and it is, the workshop of the world, generating more than 30% of global manufacturing value added. But global production is organized along the lines of global production chains. And when one looks at those, it's not Chinese enterprises that predominate, but US multinationals. So these lead enterprises, which are primarily US, or at least heavily, mostly US, they dominate the chains in terms of pricing, in terms of technology, in terms of licensing, in terms of tax avoidance. They retain for themselves high-value activities. They shift on to other enterprises, particularly those that come from the periphery, labor-intensive activities, and they force them into long cash conversion cycles. They compress margins and so on, and in this way, they shift surplus towards the United States. So, not accidentally, the large US multinationals that control the global value chains are also the main centers of profit making by individual capitalist units across the world. Chinese enterprises are way below the US enterprises. Now, the dominant position of US multinationals would be impossible without the dominant position of globalized US finance. That means, and I will explain in a bit more detail in a minute, banks and asset managers, investment funds, hedge funds, shadow banks, essentially. These financial institutions with global reach set the balance sheets, determine collateral, determine compliance terms, and reinforce US multinational dominance over the global production chains. It's a mutual interaction, mutual servicing of each other. Finance facilitates the terms of domination. Production generates the value out of which finance makes profits. And the most characteristic aspect of this new period that we've been living through since 2007, 2009, which I will name in a minute, is the shift of finance that is very, very notable, or more accurately, the shift of financialization from what I call Mark I to Mark II. Mark I financialization characterized global capitalism from about the early 80s to the crisis of 2007, 2009. That was a period dominated by commercial banks, US commercial banks, and it was a period in which financial profit came out of the spread between the lending rate and the borrowing rate of the commercial banks, the banks, plus fees and commissions. That was the time of the great housing bubble in the United States and the disaster that followed. The period since then has been dominated by shadow banks, which were present before, and which are funded by commercial banks to a certain extent, but they're distinct financial institutions, they're portfolio managers. And as such, the profit model is very different to commercial banks. They profit fundamentally from the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate, which drives capital gains, and therefore they depend and rely on asset prices continuing to rise sustainably. This has become possible because of the incredible role of the states since 2007, 2009 in creating vast volumes of liquidity through the central bank and becoming indebted itself. The state would issue debts to sustain accumulation with the left hand and would buy the debt by creating fiat money through the central bank with the right hand. These volumes of liquidity, which are without precedent in the history of capitalism, are precisely what allowed financialization to shift towards Mark II. It's precisely what allowed the big three or big four of these asset managers to emerge as the largest gatherers and concentrators of property rights in the history of capitalism. Now, I don't have time to go into the rest of the imperial apparatus, pivoting on the dollar, no time to discuss subordinate financialization, the way in which this system dominates what used to be, still is the periphery, and forces it into subordinate position economically and politically, combines exploitation and oppression as imperialism always does. I want to say a few words about the main challenger to the United States, the transformation that has emerged in the global geopolitics as a result of this underlying shift of global capitalism. Because you see, capitalism goes in certain directions but never produces the desired results for those who run it. And as the US corporations became dominant across the world, on the one hand, they induced the weakening of the United States as a center of national capitalist accumulation. And on the other, they facilitated the rise of independent centers of capitalist accumulation in what used to be the periphery, which is no longer the periphery in the classical Marxist sense because there is no non-capitalist world anymore. Everything is capitalistic, or at least everything is dominated by the capitalist spirit when it comes to how the economy is run. And so a series of challenges have emerged as these mechanisms unfolded, challenges in the economic field. Clearly the main one is China, but not only. I don't have time to talk about the other challenges, so I will focus on China, which is the dominant, productive national center in the world. But the rise of China in this regard can also be, and is often misleading by those who like to telescope things and assume that the world is moving in certain directions when actually it's not. Because when you look at China more closely, then the paradox that I mentioned originally becomes a very real process. The renminbi is not an international currency of stature. Chinese national debt cannot act as collateral internationally. Chinese clearing mechanisms are very, very a small part of SWIFT. Crucially, Chinese enterprises operating globally work with far less long-term debt than US enterprises, and that is because they cannot borrow in a currency that their own state creates. Not only this, but Chinese large multinationals are exposed, or corporations with international engagements are heavily exposed to the dollar, to the tune of perhaps $1.5 to $2 trillion. They rely on dollar liquidity. This then indicates how the challenger works. The challenger operates within rules that the challenger did not write. The United States wrote the rules. And it operates within rules and conditions that it cannot change. Because to change the rules and conditions, China would have to alter its own internal economic structure. For the renminbi to begin to act internationally, for finance to become another center of power for China, it would have to deregulate its capital account. It would have probably to abandon national ownership over its banks. It would have to transform its economy and truly financialize. But if that were to happen, then the basic mechanisms that led to Chinese prominence as a national center of accumulation will be undermined. So you can see the problem, the structural problem that the Chinese Communist Party finds itself confronting. And so the United States faces a challenge from China and other powers too, all of which come from the periphery. It has subdued the old imperial powers. All the challenges come from the periphery. They are economic challenges in the first instance. This is economic competition in the classical imperial sense. But there is no obvious resolution. The United States cannot impose its will on others the way it used to. It cannot do so economically, it cannot do so politically, and it cannot do so militarily. It cannot impose its will on Iran, never mind on China or Russia. It's utterly impossible. So, effectively, it cannot act as a hegemon. What it does is to act as the biggest player. What explains the transformation is precisely this. The United States has moved away from hegemonic rule by consensus, because that's what hegemon does, creates an umbrella under which other powers can imagine that they're pursuing their own interests when they're acting under the hegemonic umbrella. It has stopped doing that, and it has transformed itself into the most aggressive and biggest player who acts through coercion, like aggressive and big players always do. So what we're confronted with is a situation that has got no obvious resolution, a situation that is not one of multipolarity as people imagine. There is no multipolarity. There is, though, constrained unipolarity. No power can do what the United States does, but the United States cannot impose its will on others like it used to. So we've got constrained unipolarity, in my judgment, and that creates an overall situation since 2009 of which can only be described as interregnum. I and my colleagues wrote a book about this, State of Capitalism, in which we discussed the interregnum. It is an interregnum that we're going through, a state of affairs that has got no obvious outcome because the old clearly cannot do what it used to and the new cannot be born. But here I am, and no doubt you will ask me to speculate on what the interregnum might lead to. And I will tell you that I think that currently there are three possible options. The first, which is the most likely, is that for the near future we will continue being in this interregnum of contestation, tensions, applications of constraints in various ways, and so on, and instability. The second is that the world might break into zones, different zones, dollar zone, renminbi zone, euro zone, still originally under some kind of systematic connection with US liquidity, and that might end up with some degree of stability. But for that to happen, you would need global cooperation, and this is not forthcoming. The United States is not acting in a cooperative way, it's acting in an aggressive way, so that is not really likely. And the third option, which is the most dangerous one, is of course intensified contestation, contested transition, which is the usual way of capitalism, and the end result of that is war. And that's ultimately why we're witnessing the intensification of militarism across the globe and the exceptional militarization of, including the old imperial powers. The constraint here is, of course, nuclear weapons. I believe that without nuclear weapons, we would have been at war already. But the nuclear option is so dramatically destructive that it acts as its own constraint. But of course, the possibility of total Holocaust cannot be no longer be considered, cannot longer be eliminated or ignored. Anyway, I don't want to leave you with this in this short presentation. What I want to say is this: confronted with this intensification of imperialism, which has got clear parallels with the pre-1914 world, economic competition among globally competing active powers, The crucial thing for the left is to find for people an independent position. The crucial condition here is to find the equivalent of the Zimmerwald position, to argue for an independent position of the left, to argue for a view that will allow for an overcoming of imperial tensions. And in this regard, we've got one major advantage, very clear in the case of the leading imperial power, the United States. And this is that the dominant position of the United States in this imperial contestation is certainly not in the interest of its working class. I do not see an American aristocracy of labor. I do not see it. On the contrary, what I see is that the intensification of US multinational presence across the world and the spread of American capitalism across the world has rebounded against the interests of American workers. It has gone together with poverty and sustained pressure on incomes, living conditions of US workers. So anti-imperialist struggle and anti-capitalist struggle in the United States can naturally coincide. This is the most hopeful aspect of contemporary imperialism, and it's up to the US left, in my judgment, but also other lefts across the world to work in that direction, to begin to overcome this system that is now threatening not only social conditions, but the existence of the world itself. Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks a lot, Costas. Thanks very much. All right, we have one more presentation from Paul Heideman, and then we can take what time we have left to have some discussion. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. I'm going to try and be briefer to hopefully get some time for discussion, but in the time that I do take, I also will try to be somewhat controversial and hopefully stimulate some discussion. So I want to argue why I think we cannot analyze the Trump administration as an expression of any kind of underlying rationale of capitalism or capital, and instead must see it as an expression of the relative autonomy of the political, and that ultimately this is grounded in the very dominance of capital that Stephen alluded to. My essay in the Register is about focuses on Trump's trade policy. And in thinking about this, I think it's helpful to look in his second term, when his trade policy has been, of course, far more aggressive and unique than in his first term, and to look at kind of the plan going in. And the document that really informs the trade policy that Trump adopted was written by Steve Maher, who is one of Trump's advisors and was at a kind of a hedge fund, I think Hudson Bay Consulting, something like that. And in November of 2024, right after the election, he wrote a document that was clearly kind of an audition for a position in the administration and laying out a strategy that he hoped would catch Trump's eye, which it did. And Maher argued that the status of the dollar as a global reserve currency that Costas was just describing is far from the US exploiting the rest of the world, is in fact a product of the rest of the world exploiting the United States. That the dollar as a reserve currency is a kind of public good that guarantees financial stability to the rest of the world while imposing heavy costs on the United States by inflating the value of the currency and thus depressing our exports. And that the rest of the world is basically ripping the United States off. Stephen, I forgot. Could you let me know at 5 minutes, please? Yes. So I can start wrapping up. Takes me a while to wrap up. So Maron's argument is the dollar as a global reserve currency is in fact the US being a sucker and providing the rest of the world with a service it needs for free. And that actually what we should want is a kind of de-dollarization of the world economy, or failing that, we should have some kind of system in which the US charges other countries a kind of fee of some sort for using the dollar, for denominating their liabilities in dollars in the way Costas was describing. etc. And Moran's document clearly caught Trump's eye, or someone who can read in the administration's eye. And Moran became, I think he's head of the Council of Economic Advisors now. And this was really the thinking that was behind the dramatic announcement of the Liberation Day tariffs in April of 2025, when the administration announced this set of tariffs that were quite extraordinary, right, that promised higher levels of tariffs than anything going back to Smoot-Hawley at the height of the kind of the dominance of what Thomas Ferguson has called the nationalist capital bloc in the United States that supported a high tariff policy to protect American manufacturing. He was taking us back almost 100 years in terms of the tariff policy. And as people began to dig under the hood, it became clear that this policy was formulated in the most simplistic and childlike way possible. There was a simple kind of two-variable equation that they used to determine the tariff rates on countries that resulted in, like 80% tariff rates on uninhabited islands because of certain accounting quirks that showed they had a trade surplus with the United States. And really demonstrated the kind of fundamental unseriousness of economic policymaking in the Trump administration. What came next was, in some ways, I think, even more interesting in that the reaction, particularly in the bond market to this, in which bond prices started fluctuating wildly, and the Trump administration started worrying out loud about queasiness in the bond market, as Trump put it. And very quickly, once this volatility became apparent, the administration backtracked significantly on these tariffs. They were rolled back. The tariffs were still much, much higher than any time in recent economic history, but the levels that were promised on Liberation Day were very quickly abandoned in what is maybe the most striking demonstration of Marxist state theory in recent American history in terms of the capital's ability to roll back policies it finds truly objectionable. So in looking at this, there's kind of an obvious question of like, who actually benefits from such an aggressive protectionist policy? Is there a constituency for it among American capital? And here, I think the answer is almost entirely no. That very few sectors of capital, large companies, were pushing these tariffs or cheering for them or supporting them in any kind of way. In fact, almost all of them were threatened. And those that weren't threatened, instead of challenging the kind of new apparatus of this new dispensation of tariff policy, instead lobbied for their own individual exclusions from the policy, which is what the 5 minutes, thank you very much, what the tech companies did. Computer hardware, many of the most important parts of computer hardware, more essentially chips, also smartphones, laptops, were all exempted from the tariff policy, which is partially why we've been able to have this massive data center build out over the last year, is because all of that stuff can be imported when all kinds of other goods, the tariffs have created prohibitive prices on. And that, I think, is behind some of the alliance that we've seen of like the tech right with the Trump administration, is that they have a kind of clientelist relationship where the Trump administration gives them favors and they loudly proclaim their support for the administration, denounce Democrats, et cetera. And that, I think, that kind of relationship extends to even figures like Jeff Bezos, who aren't really part of the tech right proper, right? They're not the kind of like consciously right-wing figures like Peter Thiel, who are trying to remake global politics around right-wing lines, but are perfectly happy to support quite right-wing policies when doing so benefits them, as you know it very often does. So on trade policy, it really seems like the administration is straying quite far from what capital wants. Though generally, aside from kind of the originally promised levels of Liberation Day, not enough so to produce any kind of concentrated backlash among capital. And I think you can tell a very similar story about the Iran war. The war on Iran that the administration has launched was, as is now obvious, so poorly planned. There was no way whatsoever, no real planning whatsoever for how this war would be won, what the U.S. would actually do if Iran did close the strait, as of course everyone knew they would. And the fact that the administration was not planning on actually dealing with a long war is obvious from things like their failure to refill the strategic petroleum reserve in the United States, which would have been the most obvious thing in the world to do if you were expecting a conflict of any duration. They weren't. Trump was convinced by Benjamin Netanyahu that it would be just like Venezuela, right? That they could overthrow them immediately. This kind of plan for war, I think, is not what actually emerges from the high planning councils of capital at the Council of Foreign Relations and similar venues, right? The kind of think tank networks that make capitalist foreign policy in the United States were actually largely not involved in the planning of this war. Instead, you have outfits like the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, which rather than an institution of capital in the way that, say, the Rand Institute, the CFR, the Atlantic Council, the Aspen Institute, these kind of Tony organizations of capital, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies is simply an adjunct of the Israel lobby. It was founded as emet, the Hebrew word for truth. It's simply a part of the Israel lobby and is not thickly connected to the kind of networks of the ruling class, to corporate boards, directorates, etc., in the way that these other institutions I've mentioned are. And so on both kind of trade policy and war, I think we have to view the Trump administration not as expressing the kind of deep logic of capital in this moment, but often actually pursuing aims that are not particularly what capital would prefer. And that, of course, raises the question of why is capital letting this happen? And I think this gets into a fundamental fact about American political economy, which is that capital in the United States is dominant but disorganized. And indeed, they are disorganized because they are dominant. Because there is such an absence of working class struggle, of a political left that is capable of challenging them at the level of state power, capital's interests can be reproduced by the structural compulsions of, capitalist relations of production. And their need to kind of organize and make policy has been considerably less than it was, say, during the New Deal or in periods in which there was more of a challenge, or indeed in countries in which labor movement is much stronger, there are stronger leftist parties, etc. And I think the Trump administration is the most kind of violent and dangerous manifestation of this fact of American political economy that we have yet witnessed. I'll just end it there because I want to leave time for discussion.
All right. Thanks very much, Paul. We got about a 25-minute late start, so we're up against the end of the session here. So rather than, we were going to have discussion among the panelists, but maybe it makes more sense to just see if there are any questions from folks who are in the audience here, and we can do maybe a 10-minute Q&A. So if we maybe have a round of questions or comments, and then maybe from there we can let people have a chance to answer. David?
Hi. Anyone can talk about this. I was fascinated by the last presentation. So maybe you can all think some more about this. So, okay, we know that generally modern capitalists have not been in favor of tariffs, for example, of this kind of trade policy. They've been in favor of the neoliberal global open trade system. They've also, fulminated for decades about the national debt, and yet the political party that they have preferred in the political party they have preferred in the United States has pushed the national debt to the point where it has become almost impossible to pay it, to really even think about paying it down. And they also, there we go, have not. It's one other point I was going to make that they don't like, but that they go along with. Well, you mentioned, for example, I don't think they're against war, but they're against these kind of ill-planned, ill-conceived, ill-strategized wars. So, and yet they continue to support and apologize for this administration And it's not just the tech pros, because I spend every day.
Interrupt real quick, just because people who are watching online can't hear you. So
Oh.
if you can just bring it closer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I'll get to the question. So maybe is there a possibility that why they like these kinds of regimes, and it's not just in the United States. Why do they support these regimes and these parties in France and in Italy and in Spain and in India, for example, other places? I mean, it strikes me that because what they would really like to get rid of is the shabby bits of political democracy that still exist, that grew out of mostly the labor movement. I mean, the Enlightenment, yes, but then the labor movement in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and now they're trying to claw it back. Maybe people could comment about that. It's
So
not
let's see
the economics doesn't matter.
Let's see if we can take one or two more.
Yes, following from David's comment, although in a different direction, all the erratic moves, where one day Trump says we're going to have 180% tariffs, and then it goes down. One day we're going to eliminate Iran from the face of the earth. The next day we have a deal, and so forth. Has a certain functionality towards capitalism, because as capitalism has become more speculative and more short term, the erraticism, the up and downs, are a source of profit. The speculative dimension of capitalism doesn't want something that is completely predictable and steady. It wants the ups and downs. So those ups and downs not only distract all of us from, thinking about things, because one day we're fearing that's going to be the end of the world. The next day we think, okay, we have another 2 weeks or 3 weeks respite. But those ups and downs are, in effect, functional for capitalism. Even though in the longer run there might be many disastrous dimensions to it, in the short run it does allow for speculative capitalism to function.
So my question was particularly about the situation of Jews pre-Nakba. I know that there was a lot of socialist movement and tendencies amongst them. And so I'm wondering, and I know that they were even supported after that by the Soviet Union, and that there was this narrative of being able to teach Arabs and teach them the way to socialism and modernization. And so I'm wondering, how did Marxist and socialist ideology fail to recognize the nature of colonization and settlement? And I've heard someone say that it was particularly because of the Cold War context and the Soviet Union wanting to support Israel, thinking that it would then be on their side. But then I'm wondering, how can we avoid those ideologies to be corrupted by global context and stay true to themselves? Thank you.
Thanks. So I think we can maybe take about 10 minutes, and we can let each of our panelists maybe take 2 to 2.5 minutes to respond to those questions. I don't know, maybe Ibrahim can go first, and then Paul, we can get maybe Costas back up while they're responding.
Well, maybe I can address the last question a little bit more directed to my line of work and research. So you're absolutely right. And in fact, there's this interesting aspect of the role of what used to be Tsarist Russia, and later became the Soviet Union, in a lot of kind of the immigration to Palestine. And so there are two instances. Well, first of all, I mean, it's Europe in general, right? Europe is always the problem, right? You're from Algeria, right? But particularly, the very first, what are called aliyahs of Jewish people from outside of Palestine, prior to 1880, there was a very small number, percentage, around 2 to 3% of the population was Palestinian Jews, right? So this is prior to 1880. Having said that, the very first aliyahs, or ascendants, as what they call it, came actually from Tsarist Russia, came because of anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia, in today Russia, Ukraine, all of these places. These were the very first immigrants going to Palestine back in the 1880s. Another aspect actually relates to a very important weapons sales deal that happened between Israel and what the Zionist militia that later became the State of Israel in 1948, and that was the Czechoslovakia weapons sale. Without that, the Israeli militias, the Haganah, the Irgun, which later became the Israeli army, would have not been able actually to commit a big part of the massacres and Plan Dalet and the ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948. And so what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of connections that connect that part of the world to what was going on in Palestine back then and right now. You are right. I think there was this, at the beginning, this view of the idea of the moshavim in Hebrew, right? The cooperative, and there were later on in the second and third aliyahs, and definitely after the early 1900s and after the Bolshevik Revolution, you had some of those ideas come about. But it was absolutely the other way around. Those people knew very little about agriculture. It was, in fact, Palestinians who, embraced a lot of those who came with, who did not carry that strong Zionist, strong Zionist aggressiveness, because it does stem from political Zionism, but later on that aggressiveness. So before that, you actually found, and you find histories of Palestinians and so Arab and Muslim Palestinians with Jewish immigrants living together, right? The story of my grandfather, absolutely, of babysitting for each other, of doing trade with each other. And it was really, at a point, there was a very famous incident, in fact, in the town that was depopulated where my grandfather came from, Zarnuqa. There was a very famous incident that happened in Zarnuqa that started the conflict, the actual, violence that was happening between people that happened there. So I think it's two aspects. I think on the macro level, there is a lot of connections between what was going on over there and in Palestine. But I think on the micro level as well, there was this notion of this perceived notion of, well, we have a sort of socialist cooperative being that we're starting over here, and in no way possible can that be viewed as kind of aggressive or colonial as we understand it and as we see it now. So I think putting all of those things together kind of helps us explain a little bit that, it's not and I'll end here, it's not a qualitative judgment of, good or bad. I think it was more of what factually had happened there and the role of political Zionism afterwards in creating the situation following the Balfour Declaration and the British mandate of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. That was a very long answer. I apologize. Exactly.
On the national debt, I think it's a fantastic example to bring up, because beginning in the 80s and extending into the 90s, it was really a central push by major institutions of American capital like the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce. They were absolutely concerned with deficit reduction policies. There was a huge push for budget cutting of all sorts. In my book, Rogue Elephant, about the history of the Republican Party, I talk about how even Newt Gingrich's kind of budget brinksmanship in 1995, or that brought about the government shutdowns, was wildly cheered on by the Chamber of Commerce. Right? They were willing to countenance pretty aggressive and politically risky tactics in order to secure budget cuts. But I think what's really important is that after about 1999, 2000, the pressure for that really declines among capital. And you can actually, there's articles in the New York Times in like 2004 in the financial sections of people being like, where did all the discussion about the deficit go? All of that pressure went away. And now you can say part of that is George W. Bush was in power and the Democrats weren't in power anymore. And what was Bush doing that was creating giant budget cuts? He was cutting taxes for the rich and for corporations. So you can make that argument, but there's also kind of a more objective, from the sense of capital at least, measure of capitalist concern over the budget, and that's Treasury bond interest rates. And those were really, really low, from the 2000s, and then for the decade or so after the financial crisis, T-bond rates remained really, really low, which said capital is not concerned about the deficit being paid off. They actually aren't really worried about it. They're willing to lend the U.S. government money at negative real interest rates once you account for inflation, because they want these really, really secure financial assets as treasury bonds. Now that's shifted in the last couple of years, and rates are rising again. And as you said, that period seems to be over. So I think we're probably in for a new period of really dedicated pushes for attacks on the welfare state, and pressure for budgetary consolidation that will be put exclusively on the back of the working class. I think budget politics are going to circle back to where they were in the 90s and the bad old days. On finance, it's absolutely true that there's sectors of finance that really profit from volatility, but there's a pretty big cost to the rest of capital for that, right? I mean, the myth, of course, is like capitalist entrepreneurs are surfing the turbulence of the market and planning everything. They're reacting immediately. But what capitalists want for the capitalists particularly who aren't in finance, which is the majority of American capital, what they want is stability. They want to be able to plan 10 years down the road, and say like, okay, we're going to invest in a new plant here, and interest rates will probably be like this, and tariffs will probably be like this. That's what they want. So I think that the sectors of capital for whom volatility is really beneficial are pretty outweighed by the sectors for whom it's really a significant cost and something that they would rather not see and not have to deal with.
So I don't know if we want to wrap here. We probably should. I guess it's 7:10. Thanks for coming, everybody. And I appreciate you making it out. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Ibrahim and Arun and Paul and Costas. I don't know. I guess we couldn't get him back up. Is that the case? Oh, Costas Lapavitsas. He was. Yeah, he left. He's there? Oh, okay. So let's let him have a chance then to also come back in for a couple of minutes.
I've only got one point to make about Trump and his chaos, which is the title of my contribution to the volume. Seeking logical order and rational thought among capitalists, especially capitalists of the type of Trump, is not necessarily a rewarding activity. Trump is clearly irrational in a number of ways. And seeking to find inner logic in what the rulers of countries do as they act in an imperial way, benefits to capital and so on, doesn't work every time. Trump made a terrible strategic mistake by attacking Iran, for instance. It's a terrible mistake for US capitalism. But having said this, working one's way through this chaotic activity, it's clear that Trump has identified one, instinctively or not, one significant problem of US capitalism, which is precisely the paradox I mentioned to begin with, that the United States, as it expanded globally, has hollowed out its own industrial base. And the hollowing out of the industrial base has created weak industrial regions. He has led to stagnant wages, and he has generated political anger, and that's why Trump has got re-elected. So the recognition of that reality, instinctively or not, is the only rational kernel in what I can see in Trump. But the solution he's proposing for it is entirely chaotic. Some of it was summed up by Miran himself, whom I also discuss in my contribution to the volume. And here, basically, the argument is dollar dominance, which I described, is against the interest of the United States because it keeps the exchange rate of the dollar high. And so what Trump wanted to do was to eliminate the trade deficit by imposing tariffs while persuading the world to keep dollar assets. Because obviously, if the world did not keep dollar assets, then the dollar will stop acting as world money. And Trump is adamant, and so are his supporters in Wall Street, that must continue. But that's impossible. You cannot be the provider of the world's currency, the world money that the rest of the world needs. This is the ultimate supplier of that, while having a balanced budget. This is Triffin's dilemma in contemporary form, and it's explosive. You cannot be the world money and run a balanced budget or a surplus. And so in dribs and drabs, this reality is imposes itself on Trump, and the chaotic outcome we witness in terms of his policies. Is there another policy that the US capitalists could follow to restore productive capacity, to re-strengthen their domestic industrial base? Yes, there is. But Trump is not advocating it. What the United States needs is a coherent industrial policy that doesn't depend on bringing down the value of the dollar and on imposing tariffs. It needs an industrial policy based on public investment, public ownership, public banking, and controlling the Wall Street. In other words, it needs an industrial policy that is based on definancialization of the United States. That's the last thing in the world that Trump wants to do. Because the only sector of the US economy that he hasn't touched in his second reincarnation as president is, of course, Wall Street. So Trump is simply a continuation of the interregnum. He's got no answer. No answer that I can see. He's flailing about. It's completely chaotic imperialism, but that doesn't make it any less dangerous and any less aggressive. It is the biggest danger to world peace at the moment.
Okay. Thanks very much. And thanks everybody for being here. I just want to point out we do have books. The Register, the new volume is for sale up there in the front. So if you're interested in purchasing a copy, please go ahead and buy our wonderful socialist commodity. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.